Hi, Carter. It's chapter 12 from the Green Ember called Water Issues. Hopeless and cold, Heather watched her brother raise the sword with trembling hands. It didn't feel real. It couldn't be real. They were just two ordinary rabbits, children, really. This can't be happening. The bees swarmed toward them with a hatred on their faces she couldn't comprehend. She closed her eyes. All was noise now. The uneasy breathing of Smalls beside her, the anxious mutterings of Pickett, the screeches of the attacking creatures, and she couldn't tell what else. Then a rattling, chinking sound made her open her eyes. The anchor chain jiggled and Heather gasped. The anchor moved again, now racing up the slope of the rock wall. Uncle Wilfred was trying again. The anchor rose in a terrific arc and once more stabbed the piled stones of the dam wall. This time it smashed through. For a second, only an anchor-sized hole appeared. Then rock chunks broke apart, spraying mortar and gravel in a great tear that avalanched down from the breach to the bottom of the wall, gushing water into the brightness outside. The breach in the dam wall caused the rest to crumble and collapse out in a terrific noise of crashing, splashing stone. A blast of sunlight filled the cave, blinding them and their attackers as the enormous pool of cavern water shifted in a moment. Here's a picture. See, they're in the boat, and there's the hole made in the wall, and that's allowing all the water to escape. "Pickett!" Heather cried, reaching out for her brother. She clasped his hand just in time to pull him into the boat as the massive pool rose and rushed toward the gaping hole in the wall of the seventh mound. Water overwhelmed the small pebble shore, surging up to meet them. Pickett made it into the boat with Heather and the still unconscious Smalls just in time. The boat rose with the swell and raced forward on the crest of a wave that smashed into their attackers, scattering them in a swirling pool. A few of them escaped upwards, but they flew back quickly, unsure of what was happening. The rabbits held on as best they could while the boat sped forward with a roaring rush of water. Outside the seventh mound, the once humble stream that had been slowly fed by a small flow of water from under the rock now raged like a river overflowing the banks. Heather gaped as they issued through the cave wall, their eyes nearly blinded by the daytime sun. She saw Uncle Wilfred twist out of the chain, dodged flying debris, and dive for the rushing boat before the bank he stood on disappeared in the gushing flood. He snagged the boat's edge with one hand, and Heather fought to pull him in. Pickett drove to the side of the boat where she held tightly to Uncle Wilfred's wrist. The boat tilted wildly. Heather believed for a moment that it would tip over, but she leaned back, steadying the boat as she and Pickett strained to pull their uncle in amid the gathering rapids of the rushing stream. At last he was in, soaking wet, wide-eyed and smiling. "Adventure!" he cried, shaking his fist at the creatures scurrying near the cave, all desperately trying to swim ashore all along the swollen bank. As they sped still further down the teeming rapid, Red-Eye Garlickson and a squadron of wolves rounded the corner of the seventh mound. Heather saw how the mound was broken open and water poured out like a mouth. Broken stone was sprayed all over the swollen banks, and trees were covered waist high in the sudden flood. The wolves appeared on a bit of land, pawing the earth and rushing back and forth in a frenzy. The scene was disappearing behind them with remarkable speed, shrinking in the spreading distance. Then the air was split by a long, bone-chilling howl. First one, then many. Heather looked away quickly. They floated in silence a few minutes, catching their breath. Heather closed her eyes and shook her head like she thought she would wake up from what felt like a dream. But when she opened her eyes again, she saw the familiar sights of Nick Hollow sliding past her on the shore. She and Pickett were passing the borders of the only place they had ever known. The stream raced on, passing long open fields dotted with little clumps of trees. Behind them, the sky grew gray as rain clouds hovered overhead, but they sped on into cloudless skies and sunshine. "I think we're safe for now. We should be well clear of them in an hour," Uncle Wilfred said. Heather managed a weary smile. She had never been as glad to see anything disappearing behind her as she was those horrible creatures with their wicked captain Red-Eye. They had caused terror and destruction and had done who knew what to her parents and baby brother, as well as her friends at Elric's farm. But they'd been robbed of some of their plunder. They had fewer victims than they intended to get. Heather took a little satisfaction in that. The boat steadied as the stream, which was still wide, got calmer. They had a great burst of momentum and were moving along at a great clip, but the water was more predictable here, and they finally began to relax. Ahead, the stream joined with Whitmer River, which rolled away south for unknown miles. Garlickson, Pickett said. Smalls called him Red-Eye Garlickson. Yes, Uncle Wilfred said through gritted teeth. That's his bloody name. Red-Eye Garlickson, he said, spitting. He's as evil a creature as you'll find in the whole world. As Morbin Blackhawk is among the lords of prey, Red-Eye Garlickson is among the wolves, and Morbin has got him for an awful alliance. Heather's mind, now that she was really relaxed for the first time, was filled with questions. Is this the same Garlicks who fought King Jupiter in the Red Valley War? Uncle Wilfred's brows rose in some surprise. Yes, that's his son back there. I'm impressed. I wasn't sure your father would be retelling you those stories. He hadn't really begun until last night, she said, tears starting to form in her eyes. She hadn't had time to cry over losing her parents and brother. It all began to weigh on her, and she turned her head away, sobbing softly. Pickett put his arm around her and said, I'm not sure if it'll be all right, but I'm glad we're together. She put her head on his shoulder and nodded. Uncle Wilfred said, It'll be all right, I think. We'll talk about a plan a bit later. And he crawled up to care for Smalls, who still lay unconscious in the front of the little boat. Smalls has had quite a knock. Don't worry, I know where we're going, and we'll be safe, at least for a little while. Please, try to rest. Heather let herself be held by her brother, and they both watched Uncle Wilfred care for Smalls. He lifted the white rabbit's head gently and examined the knot there, nodded to himself, and searched in his satchel. He consulted a small book and made Smalls as comfortable as he could. Uncle Wilfred then sat by him, holding his hand and looking at the young rabbit with the kind of concern their father showed when they were hurt. They looked so alike, Father and Uncle Wilfred. We didn't know we had any cousins, Heather said, as the little boat slid further down the stream. They were drifting quickly down the middle of the river now. Uncle Wilfred's eyes widened and he looked around, not catching her gaze. Eventually he nodded, saying nothing for a long while. He worked to straighten the boat in the increasing current of the river, then returned to attending Smalls. Finally he spoke again. He wasn't looking at them, but from Small's peaceful face to the wide lands on the shore and the setting sun above. Smalls is a fine rabbit, as fine as any I've known, and that's saying a lot. I don't think you saw it, Heather, but he saved your life. Without him, I never could have stopped Garlickson and that other wolf. Heather wanted to ask about Uncle Wilfred's wife, but was afraid to. There was too much of loss and sadness already in this tiny boat. She was afraid to raise another question that could haunt them. Perhaps she thought our aunt's been killed, along with who knows who else. It is a terribly dangerous world, she said. She supposed it always had been, but she was only now really experiencing it. Heather, Uncle Wilfred said quietly. He nodded at Pickett, who Heather could see as she turned, was fast asleep. Finally able to relax, Pickett had fallen asleep with his arm around Heather. He was leaning against her. She leaned into him and snuggled, then laid him gently down and patted his head. Heather realized she was more exhausted than she could ever remember being. Her eyes drooped. You should get some rest too, Heather dear, Uncle Wilfred said. He'd never looked more like Father sitting there, smiling kindly down on them. She half expected him to kiss her cheeks and whisper a blessing in her ear. But he went back to care for Smalls. Then she did feel lost. Where are you, Father? Where are you, Mother and baby Jax? She turned to look behind as all the world that she had ever known was disappearing in the distance. After the mad rushing and horrible noise of the last hours, the river was gentle and the country was quiet. She crumpled beside Pickett and fell asleep before the first star of night appeared. It's the end for now, honey. Love you.